Okay, so to start this explanation, we will start with explaining how the resting membrane potential is established. So, to start, the resting membrane potential is basically, to start, it's typically negative 70 millivolts. We'll explain how it gets that negative number. So it's established by a few factors. So first, we have these negatively charged proteins on the inside that contribute to this negative 70 a little bit. Some of the properties going along with this that help make this negative is that the membrane keeps large anions inside. So like these proteins, for example, they can't just go through the membrane, so they stay there, and they're going to affect this negative 70 a little bit. So that plays a little role. Another role that is played is this sodium-potassium pump, which we covered in the last video. But to explain briefly, 3 sodium are pumped out, 2 potassium are pumped in. So you'd think, well, over time, more positive charges are getting pumped out instead of pumped in, so the inside must be more negative because of that. Well, that's true, but it doesn't contribute that much. It just contributes a little bit to this negative 70. The main contributor is this right here. So we create gradients with this sodium-potassium pump. So a bunch of sodium out here, a bunch of potassium in here. So naturally, the chemical and another property is that the membrane is more permeable to potassium. So sodium is kind of stuck out here. It wants to come in, but it can't really because there's not many channels for it. But there are a bunch of channels for potassium. So potassium builds up big time in here. And so the chemical gradient says, okay, I want to go out of the cell. So it does. The chemical gradient makes potassium leave the cell. So as it leaves the cell, it's leaving behind these negative charges. So the cell is going to become more and more negative. But as this potassium leaves, the electrical gradient says, okay, well, now there's a greater negative charge on the inside, so it attracts those potassium ions that just left, and it actually brings them back in. So this little cycle right here, this kind of competition, creates an equilibrium. And when that equilibrium is met, this is what is the membrane potential, or the resting membrane potential. So we went over some properties of the membrane that account for that. Factors that affect the resting membrane potential and the factors that affect the magnitude. So some of these factors can include conditions like hyper or hypocalcemia, hypokalemia, or hypernatremia, various things. And basically what that's talking about, it's referring to the outside of the cell membrane. So, for example, hyperkalemia, for example, is basically a bunch of potassium here on the outside. So it's extra potassium on the outside, or more on the outside, hyperkalemia. And basically what that does is it makes potassium less likely to leave the cell, because if there's a bunch of positive charges out here, then the chemical gradient says, well, no, I don't really want to go out of the cell because there's all these positive charges. So less potassium is going to leave the cell, which makes this more positive. And this will lead to a more positive thing, which eventually leads to an action potential. And we'll get to action potentials in a second. So this little part, Nernst equation driving force. So what the Nernst equation is is it determines the equilibrium potential for a single ion, or basically where, kind of like this net flow that we talked about, where it's at equilibrium. We can do that for any ion, basically. So what we do, we have this equation here. So E of X is just the ion. So in the case above, we'd do potassium. Again, put potassium here, potassium there. So this is potassium in the concentration of potassium inside the cell. This is the concentration of potassium outside the cell. This is just constant. Anyway, so we plug all the numbers that were given in, and we come out with a number. And where this is applicable is right here with driving force. So driving force basically tells us so driving force, what it is it's the membrane potential, or like the voltage of the membrane potential. So it would be that -70 in this case, minus whatever number we got from the Nernst equation. So if we were to plug in some numbers and we come out with a positive number, let's say, then what we would do is let's take a cell, for example. We'll take a little cell and we'll put that, let's say we come out with a negative number. Let's say it's a -15, just a random number. Well, depending on what ion we're using, let's say we used potassium. Let's do sodium. So let's say we use sodium and we came out with a -15. So how to determine, driving force determines the flow, like how strong the flow will be, as well as the direction. So in this case, how big the number is determines the strength of it, and then the negative or positive determines where it'll go. So if we put this -15 inside the cell, and if we were to put sodium inside the cell with this negative, well, a negative and a positive attract, so we know that sodium is going to go into the cell. So that's kind of what driving force tells us. It tells us the strength and where it's going to go. So that is driving force. Okay. So now moving on to an action potential. So an action potential is, so we have this membrane potential. We set this membrane potential of -70, and then something like a rush in of, so some stimulus will cause an influx of sodium, or in some cases it also could be calcium, I believe. Anyway, anything that raises that membrane potential to a more positive number. And this little part right here where it gets raised is called a graded potential. And there's differences between a graded potential and action potential. So a graded potential is basically, action potentials are all or nothing. So if a certain number is hit, usually -55, if this threshold is hit, then an action potential is automatically generated. It does this whole thing. However, if a graded potential is just this little part before that tries to get it to threshold. But graded potentials can also not reach threshold. They can be like that, and then maybe one will reach threshold, and then it'll go. But graded potentials they aren't all or nothing like action potentials are. So what happens is that we have an influx of sodium or calcium or something that raises the resting membrane potential, and then it hits threshold. And so once it hits threshold, a bunch of voltage-gated sodium channels open. So what happens if we see this little contraption thing? So the influx of positive charges cause this little spring thing to coil, I guess you could say, and it opens this lever, and sodium rushes into the cell. So sodium rushes in, again, that's going to create, it's going to make the cell super, super positive, so it comes all the way up here. Right here is like the peak. This is when sodium channels close and when potassium channels open. So the potassium leak channels are always open, like we talked about, that keeps that resting membrane potential. So those are just always open, and the pump is always going. But there's there's potassium voltage channels, which start to open right here, and then those go out of that potassium goes out of the cell, and this makes it more and more negative. So this phase right here is called depolarization, where we're going more positive. This is called repolarization, or we're coming back down, or the falling. This little part is called hyperpolarization. This part is interesting because this is where, so the potassium channels are open. And so potassium is going out of the cell, making it more and more negative. But potassium doesn't move as quickly as sodium, and so it takes a little longer. And so actually before the before the potassium channels can close all the way, a little bit more comes in. So this is called hyperpolarization, where it goes a little bit further than normal, but then the pump and the leak channels kind of even that out. So that's what happens in each of the stages as far as ions, where they're going, and gradients and channels and everything like that. And basically what action potential is it just sending a signal to go perform a certain function in the body. Okay, let me cross this off so I can stay on track. So the relative refractory period and the absolute refractory period, that is basically when, so the absolute refractory period is talking about this part of, of depolarization and repolarization. So it basically means that this whole thing can't repeat in action potential. So no matter how strong the stimulus is, another action potential can't be stimulated until all of the sodium channels are kind of reset. It's like everything has to reset before we can do it again. So that's the absolute. And then the refractory, that was the absolute refractory period. The relative refractory period is referring to hyperpolarization. And basically what that says is that a similar thing, how everything needs to be reset before we can do another action potential. But that one is talking about how it has to be a greater signal in order to generate another one. So again, refractory periods are just the time when a cell cannot repeat an action potential until everything is kind of reset. So those are action potentials. We compared and contrasted gradient potential with action potentials. So now moving on to capacitance and length constant. So coming down here to this. So capacitance is basically the ratio of charge that is separated right up here. So this is charge separated compared to the voltage that is generated. So like here, we have a cell membrane. We have a lot of charge separated, and we have this voltage of -70. So that's all capacitance is just the ratio between those two things, the charge separated and the voltage generated. So in this case, capacitance would be high because there's a lot of charge separated for this membrane potential for that voltage that's generated. So anytime this number is bigger, like in this case, there's more charges separated as opposed to like over here where there's less charges separated. Anytime this number Q is bigger, capacitance is going to be up. Now the other thing I asked for was length constant. So length constant is basically how far a channel can travel inside a cell. Or inside a cell. So that channel, for example, let's say that's sodium. Again, kind of going back to action potentials. This all has to deal with action and gradient potentials and everything. So that signal that's being sent to go perform a function in your body, it's sent, and length constant is how far that thing can travel. So let's explain this a little more. So the problem with this is that membrane resistance is very low. So there's not much between this positive charge and this negative charge. So these are going to be very attracted to each other. There's a bunch of competition between these positive charges all next to each other and these negative charges. But they like the positive to negative charges so much that they're just going to sit there and they're going to deal with that competition anyway. But this means that when a signal comes through like a positive charge, there's so many negatives here that that positive charge is just kind of going to get stopped pretty quickly because of all of these negatives. So it can't travel very far. However, if we were to decrease that increase the membrane resistance. So if we make these bigger separation, then there's not as strong, there's still an attraction here, but it's not as strong. And so basically this competition that I was talking about over here, it's going to kind of trump this interaction. And so what's going to happen is that these charges are going to spread apart. And this leads to less internal resistance, which allows the signal to travel further. And this is also, again, length constant is how far it travels. So we have a greater length constant here. This is what squids do. They can increase the size of their neurons, for example, and make that resistance bigger and make the internal resistance lower. However, we're not squids and we can't have big neurons, so we need something else. That's where myelin comes in. So myelin basically does the exact same thing. It creates more membrane resistance. So this is just a whole cell. So this is all this inside of the cell. All this is the outside of the cell. So what myelin does is it separates this positive and negative charge a little more. Again, so that competition between these positive and negative charges, they spread apart. And so we have the same effect without having to make our neurons bigger. And so, again, this charge is separated, so it won't get stuck with all these negative charges right here because they're separated. So these positive charges are able to travel further. So basically what myelin does is it speeds up everything, makes everything go faster. It just makes things more effective, because if we have less internal resistance, then this can travel further and everything can just go a lot faster. Make sure I got everything. Okay, I think that is it.